What role do civilians play in domestic and international policy?
Well, for advising purposes, for presidents, an important role. And I think that President Eisenhower, did an excellent job in utilizing the resources of civilian advisors. The 1950s was a time of tremendous technical change, and with the tensions of the Cold War, Eisenhower had to rely on those experts in science, in technology, in government and politics to come together and give him sound recommendations to how to develop a strong national defense, because quite frankly the United States was in new territory at this point in the Cold War. How do we guard against a possible surprise attack from the Soviet Union? What resources do we have where we don't have to tax the American people so heavily? And so what Eisenhower did was he used some of the best minds in president of MIT and Caltech and former State Department employees and so on and so forth in order to give him recommendations as to how to proceed. And in doing that, it's an ad hoc committee. They don't have a political stake. They're not Republicans and Democrats in forming a particular presidency, but rather they all have the best interest of the nation. And he can ultimately make his own decisions, but in having these civilian ad hoc committees help inform him, he was able to get buy-in from a lot of people and have some humility that he didn't know everything in an age where technology was changing so rapidly. A lot of these people have worked together on various other organizations and committees and groups. A lot of them came from World War II, where the United States utilized some of the bigger engineering schools for the Manhattan Project and the radiation laboratory. And so it's a network of people who had experience serving the government, even though not in elected official capacity. So, and his national security advisor was very well connected and was able to craft really good committees. And perhaps the most important would be one that happened in the mid part of his tenure as president, called the Killian Committee. Technically it was the Technological Capability Panel, but James Killian was the chair, and so it's often known as the Killian Committee. Two things that came out of that committee was an emphasis on intercontinental ballistic missile technology, or ICBM program, what Eisenhower would call bigger bang for your buck. And probably what the audience is most familiar with or has some name recognition with is the U-2 reconnaissance planes, and that's where the United States was able to do these overflights. Some members of your audience might remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was the U-2s that first brought back photographic evidence that the Soviet Union was placing missiles on Cuba. So that program came from one of these civilian ad hoc committees that Eisenhower had convened.
How did these committees get along with the actual administration?
Depended on the committee. The first two committees that I looked at in my book got along very well, and Eisenhower had a lot of oversight in picking the committee members, in having known the committee members. The third committee kind of came to him from some political pressure. The third committee was looking at whether or not the United States federal government should allocate resources for fallout shelters, so a massive national fallout shelter. Eisenhower didn't believe that the United States should, that resource, that money should be used for active defense, not the passive defense. He was also concerned with the kind of message it would send to both our allies and the Soviet Union if we embarked on this massive fallout shelter program. And so that committee disagreed with Eisenhower, and many of the members leaked information to the press which indicated the United States was in the gravest danger. Eisenhower had not prepared us, our defenses were weak, and that did not go over well with Eisenhower. And we can look at that committee as really the end point of him using these civilian ad hoc committees. My interest in this topic when I was a graduate student, in fact, stemmed from my interest in science and technology as used by presidents. And then as I was revising my dissertation for the manuscript, the War on Terror had just begun. And I started to see a lot of parallels between the Cold War and the War on Terror, and the challenges that George W. Bush faced in terms of, preparing for the long haul, something that Eisenhower spoke a lot of. And so I began to look at the role of civilians being played out in presidencies after Eisenhower, and my conclusion was that each president really used them differently. And the committees really were a reflection of presidential leadership styles. One thing that really did surprise me was how good Eisenhower was at creating a team spirit. And that came back to his early days at West Point. And he really was personable. People liked him. He really felt, he made you feel like he was listening to you, you had good ideas, they were valid ideas, that he would consider those ideas. Even if he had in mind what he was really going to do, he really created a team spirit where everybody felt like they were contributing to his presidency. And that harkens back to his leadership as a general, I'm sure, but I was really surprised at how much effort and conscious effort at that to make everybody feel like they were part of the same goal. The book title is Eisenhower's Fine Group of Fellows, but crafting a national security policy that adheres to the Great Equation. And so what I want the readers to come away with is an understanding of how important the Great Equation is to any presidency. And the Great Equation is that we need a high morale. We can't be scared to death. We can't cower inside afraid of a biological attack or a nuclear attack. But we also have to make sure our finances are in order. We can't overburden the American people paying for a heavy defense program. And then finally, we do have to make sure that our national security is secure, that we do have what we need without having the overkill. And for that, it's the Great Equation, and it's the difficulty for the president to make sure that we balance that high spiritual morale, financial responsibility, and yet still have strong defense.